James Franklin's comments this weekend about the whole college football commissioner thing, and particularly giving a shout out to Nick Saban. I think I want to put my 2 cents into this whole conversation. I've talked about this on the show a little bit about a college football commissioner, and that was a couple months ago, and been reflecting on the season and kind of saying to myself, there's a whole lot of things that are screwed up in college football, right? You think of conference realignment is just completely all over the place to the point where having those big rivalries you just simply don't get them anymore, unfortunately. I mean, granted, there's some of them still there, but it's not the same as it used to be. And then we talk about the NIL stuff, obviously, the transfer portal, just how lenient everything is. There's no sort of checks or balances or anything. There's no sort of implementation in terms of rules or consequences. If there's coaches can tamper, schools can tamper. Jim Morris said this in terms of one of his players essentially getting tampered with. Wisconsin's now trying to stop Miami from taking a guy. It's a whole shit show. And then between that, you have the screwed up college football calendar. You have coaches complaining about they don't have enough time in between the games, and now we're talking about conference championships getting rid of, and then now players are in the portal while the bowl games are happening. It's all screwed up, and it's to the point now where everything is happening. Nothing is happening because everybody's making money. Everybody's making money. Viewership in college football is as high as ever. You have all these different faces that are now being involved with college football, which I love, by the way. At the end of the day, I'm all for how can you get different faces involved in college football. I love, for example, Barstool Sports. They did a bowl game last year. I think that's great. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but there is a market for that. So at the end of the day, hey, you can get people out there. Why not? Snoop Dogg, he did his little bowl game with Miami, Ohio versus Colorado State. And there's people who will tune in just to hear Snoop Dogg bullshit about college football, even if it's a couple group of five schools going at it. I mean, hey, why not? It's a win-win. The kids get to essentially go on a little vacation. They get to celebrate their plus 500 season, and Snoop gets a little bit of publicity and love from the whole thing. So why not, right? And you sit there and say to yourself, it's just a whole lot of clusters that really aren't coming together. And as long as all these different parties are all getting a piece of their pie, nobody's going to go and fix it all. So that's part of the reason why this whole commissioner thing has come out to begin with. And James Franklin has said this, Jim Morris said this, and Lane Kiffin has too, in terms of either a need for a commissioner or just particularly shouting out Nick Saban in general. So I guess we can address this in two parts. I guess one, do we really need a college football commissioner? I think is really the biggest question here. And also, would Nick Saban in particular be a good fit for a college football commissioner? So I guess let's just talk about the fit in terms of Nick Saban. I think Nick Saban, I think what I love about Nick Saban on College Game Day is he just looks like he's having fun. And I always ask myself that really you can talk about college football, or anything that you do in life. If you're not having fun with what you're doing, then what's the purpose of it, right? And that's the one thing I think I really enjoy, and one thing that's a big difference between certain analysts or certain broadcasters is you can tell the chemistry is there so naturally with Nick Saban on there, with Pat McAfee and Desmond Howard and Reese Davis. And even when they're interviewing certain coaches, everyone just looks a lot more comfortable too. I mean, granted, they're going to ask them some tough questions here and there, and they're going to ask them some X's and O's, but the reality of it too is Nick Saban, much like my example with Snoop Dogg and all that, he's bringing eyes to the product. And I'm sure ESPN's paying him a very handsome salary to do all that. And it's a nice balance for him because he doesn't have to deal with reshaping a roster every year, having to go down to high schools, paying all these kids money, then next year having to worry about whether these kids are going to leave. So you don't have to worry about that anymore. And he left at the perfect time because he's in his 70s now. He has nothing left to prove. He's done everything you can possibly ask for. I mean, he went to Michigan State, LSU, Alabama, and all that too. But I think if you're Nick Saban, I don't so much question or not whether or not he'd be a good commissioner, because if anybody has seen all the highs and lows of college football, it's him. And he even insinuated this when he retired, is that part of the reason why he wanted to leave anyway was in part because of all the changes and all of just the pretty much the free for all of it. There's nobody sitting there saying, "Oh, you're going to sit here and transfer. Well, you're going to have to sit out for 4 games," or "Oh, you're going to have to pay a fee to this school." Much like, to me, college football is turning much into like Premier League. That's the biggest comparison that I get, in the sense of, if you have to pay to play to some extent. I mean, even ESPN put out a big article about New Mexico State essentially being on the ropes in terms of their athletic budget. Jerry Kill freaking running out of coffee. The big $1 million payday that Auburn got was to cancel out the budget. It's just insane, and I think a lot of people don't realize how much of a discrepancy there is between the biggest programs in the country, like your Alabamas and your Michigans and your Oregons and all that, versus your smaller schools like your New Mexico States, like your Georgia Southerns, Sun Belt teams, etc. And I don't even think so much that's necessarily the problem, but it's how can you put everything all together? Because even if you look at it statistically, if you pull up some stats between Group of 5 schools versus Power 4 schools, the percentage of those games where Group of 5 schools have actually won, it's incrementally have gone down every single year, and that's by and large because of just the sort of hierarchy in terms of college football. It's just much more evident now. And I don't know if Nick Saban can even address that. And even if he is the right person for the job, like, how much authority does he actually have? Because the reality is, a lot of people tend to dismiss this part about the NCAA. And one of the reasons why I try to defend the NCAA here and there, as much as, sometimes Charlie Baker can be kind of full of crap. But the reality is, before all of this sort of was a free for all, the NCAA actually did try to put out some limitations here and there in terms of, hey, if you're going to transfer, you're technically supposed to sit out for a year, or hey, if you're going to transfer, then you can only accept from the collectives, for example, or the school can't get involved with anything, or tampering would actually be enforced to some degree. All of those things were supposed to be a part of it, but now it's to the point where you can't even enforce anything, because who are you going to enforce? Because as soon as the NCAA tries to do something, a Tennessee or an Oklahoma or some other state legislator who knows absolutely nothing about college football is going to sue to oblivion. And that's what's happening in the NCAA right now, in the whole House settlement thing. It's going to get to a point where they're just going to get sued so freaking hard that essentially the NCAA is eventually going to dissolve, and there's going to be no entity that's really overseeing college athletics at all. And I'm not even saying it has to be the NCAA. I think it has to be somebody. Maybe it is a commissioner. But the reality is, unless the commissioner has the authority to make some executive decisions, to suggest some things that are good for the long term of college football, it doesn't even really matter if we do have one. And do I think Nick Saban could be it? Absolutely. But if you're Nick Saban, I think you're replacing the one stresses of being a coach with all the stresses of now, okay, now I'm going to have the stress of trying to essentially save the game that I love. And in order to have these conversations to happen, you have to get all these big athletic directors. You have to get the Jim Phillips of the world, the Brett Yardmarks, the Greg Sankeys. You're going to have to get them all at the table. And it's going to get to a point where the Big Ten and the SEC are going to come together and say to themselves, well, why do I need to get Jim Phillips approval on this when we control the majority of the market of college football? And then you sit there and say, Gloria Nunez over in the Mountain West and the new Pac-12 that's being involved in the Sun Belt. You sit there and say, well, how are they supposed to be involved too? There's tens of thousands of athletes over there too that deserve to be a part of this game too. And I just don't know how you can put that all together too. And you can get into the weeds about, oh, Nick Saban might only care about the Big Ten and the SEC. I'm not even going to get into that part of it. I'm just simply talking about, at this point in time, the reality is, do I think we need a college football commissioner? Not necessarily. I think there just needs to be a third party or an independent party that's looking over the game of college football, whether that means it's a commissioner plus a sort of union like the NFL has, which I think that's kind of what's going to end up being shifted to, or you have some sort of equivalent of an NCAA where it is a governing body who essentially overlooks everything, and they are responsible for overseeing people who are tampering, overseeing to making sure that the kids are coming to class on time, in charge of sanctioning schools. Those things still need to happen in college football. And right now, like, when's the last time you ever heard about anybody being suspended for anything regarding a sanction or a violation? The last thing I can remember is when Kurt Ferentz got a 1 game slap on the wrist for the whole Cade McNamara situation. So even then, it's like you have to take that with a grain of salt. But let me know what you think down in the comments about all of this. But